The training hall on the third floor of the Glendale Athletic Complex did not announce itself. There was no sign above the stairwell door, no name on the frosted glass panel beside it, nothing to indicate that the room behind that door was anything other than another rented space in a building that rented spaces to anyone who needed a floor and four walls and enough overhead clearance to do what they came to do. It was a Thursday morning in March of 1981. The room smelled of old mat rubber and the faint mineral trace of sweat that embeds itself into wooden floorboards over years and does not leave. There were 31 people inside. Most of them were seated along the east wall on a row of folding chairs that had been arranged before anyone arrived, as though someone had known precisely how many witnesses would be needed. They had not been arranged for a confrontation, they had been arranged for a seminar. Victor Rasmussen was 28 years old. He had been born in Copenhagen, trained first in Denmark and then for 4 years in Osaka under an instructor whose lineage ran in a direct line back to one of the original students of the art's founder, which in the world Rasmussen inhabited was the equivalent of a provenance that stopped all other conversation. He stood 6 feet 11 and 3/4 inches in bare feet, a measurement that every publication that had ever written about him rounded up to 7 feet, because the fraction made the number imprecise and the number itself was already improbable enough that precision seemed beside the point. He weighed 259 pounds. He had a reach that his primary instructor in Osaka had measured twice at 91 inches and had then written down in his notes with a remark beside it in Japanese that translates roughly as, "The architecture of this man was designed with a different purpose in mind than the purposes most men are designed for." He held a 4th-degree black belt in full contact karate. He held a second in Aikido. He had competed in 16 sanctioned bouts over a period of 3 years and had won all 16, 11 of them before the scheduled conclusion, and of those 11 early stops, 7 had required no second technique. He was, by the assessment of every credentialed observer who had evaluated him through the spring of 1981, the most physically imposing martial practitioner operating in the Western Circuit. In the next 19 seconds he was going to encounter something his architecture had not been designed to answer. The man seated in the 4th chair from the left end of the row, along the east wall, was wearing a canvas work shirt the color of old straw, with the sleeves rolled to just below the elbow. He had on dark trousers with a pleat that had not survived the morning particularly well and a pair of plain-soled shoes that had last been resoled some months before. He was 51 years old. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall. He had a short beard going gray at the jaw and a canvas cap that he had set on his knee when he sat down rather than removing it from his head, which meant it sat on his knee at a slight angle, slightly more to one side than the other, in the manner of an object placed by a man not particularly interested in the placement. He was watching the front of the room with the quality of attention that is not intense in the theatrical sense but is complete in the functional sense. The attention of a man who misses very little and finds very little worth showing that he has noticed. His name was on no registration sheet for that seminar. He had arrived with a man named Frank DeLuca, a former tournament competitor turned trainer, who had been one of the people who helped organize the event, and he had sat down in the 4th chair without speaking to anyone except DeLuca, and DeLuca had not introduced him to anyone, and no one in the room who did not already know had asked. In 19 seconds, every person in that room would know exactly who he was, and would spend the rest of their lives being unable to forget it. There is a detail about what happened that morning that none of the accounts written about it in the years following ever managed to place correctly.
And it is this: the confrontation was not sought. It was not arranged. It was not the product of a rivalry or a history between the two men, or of anything that had been building toward a specific point of resolution.
It arrived the way certain kinds of weather arrive, without particular announcement, as the natural result of conditions that had been accumulating in a room for long enough that their meeting was not a surprise to the conditions themselves, only to the people inside them. Victor Rasmussen had come to Glendale because he had been invited to lead the seminar by its organizer, a karate instructor named Dennis Park, who ran a studio 3 miles away, and who had brought Rasmussen to California twice before for workshops that had been regarded by the practitioners who attended them as among the best technical instruction available anywhere on the West Coast. Rasmussen's approach to teaching was the same as his approach to competition: methodical, thorough, built on a belief that technique correctly understood is technique that cannot be countered by size or speed alone, only by superior technique. This belief had served him without interruption for 3 years and 16 bouts. He arrived at the complex at 8:45 in the morning. He spent the first 20 minutes of the seminar on footwork, which is where he always began. Because footwork is the grammar of every other sentence a practitioner learns to construct, and a man who begins with grammar rather than vocabulary is a man who understands that the thing he is teaching is a language and not a collection of impressive words. He moved through the room while he spoke, demonstrating with the clarity of someone who has taught these things long enough that the demonstration and the explanation have become the same action. He was genuinely good. The people on the folding chairs who knew enough to evaluate what they were watching knew that what they were watching was good. He covered footwork for 20 minutes, and then grip theory for 15, and then he asked for a volunteer from the room to assist in a demonstration of the relationship between grip angle and structural leverage in a close-range scenario. A man named Raymond Chu, who held a third-degree black belt and had competed at the regional level for 9 years, raised his hand. He was 5 feet 8 inches and weighed 168 pounds. Rasmussen thanked him and brought him to the center of the mat. What followed was a demonstration that lasted 11 minutes and covered 7 distinct technical points, each illustrated with a live application using Chu as the demonstrating partner. It was precise. It was patient. It was the work of a man who cares about the transmission of what he knows rather than the performance of it, and the people watching it leaned forward in their chairs in the particular way that people lean forward when they are learning something that feels immediately true and immediately usable. Rasmussen released Chu with a nod of thanks and turned back to the room. He made an observation. It was not the kind of observation that a careful man would have made in that room on that morning with those specific people in the chairs along the east wall, but Rasmussen was not a careless man, and what he said was not careless, which is precisely what made it land the way it did. He said that in his experience teaching across Denmark, Japan, and now the United States, the single most consistent gap he encountered in Western practitioners was what he called structural timidity, a reluctance to commit force to a technique at the moment the technique required it, born from training environments where contact had been progressively reduced to the point where practitioners no longer understood, in the body rather than the mind, what full committed application actually required. He said this was not a criticism of any individual in the room. He said it was an observation about a culture of practice. He said that the gap between what American martial arts looked like at its best and what it was capable of at its best was, in his assessment, wider than most American practitioners were willing to acknowledge. And that this gap was not a failure of skill, but a failure of honest evaluation. He said it without heat. He said it as a man states a measured professional conclusion after years of relevant observation. He was looking at the room generally when he said it, not at any individual. He was looking at the room generally, but the room was looking at the fourth chair from the left end of the east wall. And the man in that chair was looking back at Victor Rasmussen with an expression that several witnesses would later describe differently. One said it was the expression of a man who has heard something familiar said in an unfamiliar context. Another said it was simply calm. A third, Frank DeLuca, who knew him better than anyone else in that room, said it was the expression he always wore in the 3 or 4 seconds before he decided to do something. Dennis Park, standing near the door, had gone very still. Raymond Chu, returning to his seat after the demonstration, stopped halfway and remained standing. The man in the fourth chair placed his canvas cap on the seat beside him. He placed it brim down, which is not the natural way to set a cap, and the specific deliberateness of it drew the eye of everyone in the room who was already watching him. He pressed both palms to his knees. He stood. He did not announce himself. He did not raise his hand. He did not look around the room to acknowledge the attention moving toward him from every direction simultaneously. He straightened to his full height, adjusted the rolled cuff on his left sleeve to match the one on his right, and walked from the east wall to the edge of the mat with the unhurried directness of a man covering familiar ground. The recognition arrived at different speeds for different people in that room. Frank DeLuca already knew. Dennis Park had understood when the man arrived that morning with DeLuca, had understood without being told, and had made a decision in that moment to let the morning proceed without introduction, and see what the morning chose to do with itself. Raymond Chu understood when the man was 6 feet from the mat edge. 2 practitioners from a studio in Burbank recognized him at the same moment and exchanged no words, only a look that covered the entire distance between astonishment and confirmation in the space of a single shared breath. Victor Rasmussen watched him approach and processed what he was seeing with the speed of a man whose processing has been trained rather than merely educated.
He tracked the movement. He evaluated the bill. He arrived at a recognition that shifted the quality of his expression from openness to something more guarded, and then, because he was a man of genuine character, from guarded to attentive. He is already lost. He cannot know it yet, because what is about to happen to him has never happened to him before.
And a man cannot prepare for the specific shape of a lesson he has not yet received. If you have followed this story to this point and you are not yet a subscriber to this channel, right now is the moment. Hit subscribe and leave a comment below telling us which country you are watching from. Because what takes place on that mat in Glendale in the next 19 seconds has been described by the practitioners who witnessed it as the single most instructive 19 seconds of their careers, and you will want to be here for every episode that follows. The man from the 4th chair stopped at the mat edge. He looked at Victor Rasmussen across the distance between them, which was 9 feet. He did not step onto the mat without invitation. He simply waited. Rasmussen looked at him for a moment, then he extended one hand toward the mat in the gesture of a man who understands that an invitation is being required of him, and is willing to offer it. The man stepped onto the mat. He stood with his feet at shoulder width and his hands at his sides and his chin level. He did not adopt a fighting stance, he simply stood. The way a man stands when he has been standing correctly for 30 years and no longer needs to think about it. His name was Chuck Norris. He had been training since 1958. He had held a black belt in Tang Sudo since 1960. He had won the professional middleweight karate championship in 1968 and had held it, without interruption, for 6 consecutive years. He was 51 years old and he weighed 171 pounds, and he was standing on a mat in Glendale, California across 9 feet of air from a man who outweighed him by 88 pounds and outreached him by 23 inches and had never, in 16 professional bouts and a career of training that stretched back to childhood, been genuinely tested by the thing he was about to be tested by. He did not stretch. He did not rotate his neck. He did not shift his weight from foot to foot in the preliminary way of men who need to locate their readiness through motion. He stood. There is an understanding that underlies every serious system of close-range fighting, and it is older than the formalized arts that teach it, and will survive longer than any particular style or lineage. It is this: the length of a man's reach is not his range. It is his maximum range, and a man whose training has been built around the use of his maximum range has, by definition, been built around a distance that a sufficiently knowledgeable opponent will never allow him to establish. Distance is not a measurement. Distance is a decision. The man who makes the decision about distance before his opponent can make it has already resolved the most important question the encounter contains. Everything after that is consequence. Victor Rasmussen had spent 12 years building techniques for his maximum range, and they were excellent techniques, and they had been sufficient for everything he had faced. He had not faced a man who understood, at the level of reflex rather than knowledge, how to prevent him from reaching that range. He was about to. Second one, Rasmussen initiated with a front kick, the same kick thrown at a man that his students had watched him use to illustrate structural leverage 20 minutes earlier at 70% of capacity. This was not 70%. This was the kick that had ended 7 bouts before their scheduled conclusion. It covered the 9 feet of air between them with a speed consistent with what an extension of that leg from a man with those proportions, launched from that stance, will produce. It was aimed at the center mass. Chuck Norris moved to his right. The movement was not large. It did not need to be large. It was 16 inches of lateral adjustment. timed not to the launch of the kick but to the commitment of it, which is a different moment and a later one, and the difference between those two moments is the entire width of the gap between a man who understands what he is watching and a man who only sees it. The kick passed through air on his left, his right hand rose and touched the inside of Rasmussen's calf as it passed, not a block. A brush, a contact so light it would not have registered as force to a man who was not specifically looking for what it did, and what it did was add 3 degrees of outward rotation to the kick's natural arc, which meant the foot landed 4 inches further to the outside than Rasmussen's structure had accounted for, which meant his landing position was not the position his next movement had been built to come from. Dennis Park, near the door, had his arms at his sides. He had not moved. Frank DeLuca, against the east wall, was watching with the expression of a man watching something he has been near before, but has never seen from this particular angle. Raymond Chu had not returned to his seat. He was standing with his weight on his back foot, leaning forward from the waist by perhaps 2 inches, in the unconscious posture of a man trying to get closer to something without moving his feet. Second 2. Rasmussen recovered. This was genuine athleticism, the recovery of a man who has been moved slightly from his intended position by a response he did not fully anticipate, and who returns to structure without the delay that most men would need. He came back to his base and adjusted his guard and threw a right-hand cross aimed at the head of the man now located to his inside right. A strike thrown with the full pendulum of that 89-inch reach moving through its arc with everything behind it. It did not arrive. Chuck Norris had moved again, this time forward and to the inside of the throwing arm rather than away from it, so that the arm passed behind his right shoulder and he was now standing at a distance of approximately 11 inches from Rasmussen's centerline. This is not a distance that the architecture of Victor Rasmussen's training had prepared him to operate in. His weapons required extension. Extension requires space. There was no space. At 11 inches, Chuck Norris's left hand found the inside of Rasmussen's right elbow at the precise moment the cross finished its arc, and the hand did not grip, it redirected. Following the natural rotation of the arm through the rest of its travel and adding a small additional vector to it, and the result was that Rasmussen's own cross became a force working briefly against the equilibrium of his right shoulder. 2 of the practitioners from the Burbank studio had both hands over their mouths, not from distress, from the involuntary physical response of people watching a proof arrive in real time. Second 3. Rasmussen's third attempt was not a technique. It was a response, the committed forward drive of a man whose previous 2 techniques have failed to connect and who understands that the resolution of the situation requires him to bring his full physical presence to bear in a way that smaller techniques have not. He dropped his center of mass and drove forward from both legs, the way a man drives through a door he has decided will not stop him. With his arms coming wide to establish the grip that would allow his size to become the governing factor, he did not make contact. Chuck Norris stepped inside the drive, not away from it but through it, to the left and slightly forward, in a movement that placed him behind Rasmussen's right shoulder at the moment the drive committed fully, and his right hand came to the back of Rasmussen's right shoulder blade, and his left hand came to the outside of the right hip, and what followed was not a throw in the technical sense of a throw, it was a completion. It was the completion of the direction Rasmussen's own committed drive had already established, extended by perhaps 18 degrees downward and to the left. And Rasmussen's body followed that direction, because the direction was already where his body was going, and the 18 additional degrees were not a force imposed from outside but a small adjustment to a trajectory already in motion. He went to the mat on his right side. He went the way a man goes when his body has been given instructions that his mind has not had time to review. His right hand touched the mat first, then his right shoulder, and he was down for a duration that Raymond Chu, reviewing his own memory of the moment for years afterward, could never fix with confidence, somewhere between 3 seconds and 8, which is the particular inaccuracy of moments that the mind needs more time to process than the body needed to experience. The room was silent in the way that rooms are silent when everyone in them has understood something at the same moment. It was not dramatic silence, it was the silence of 31 people simultaneously recalibrating. The mat was the same mat it had been 19 seconds earlier. The overhead lights continued to fall on it at the same angle. Somewhere in the building below, an elevator moved between floors and its cable made a sound in the shaft, and the sound did not know or care about anything that had just happened on the third floor. Chuck Norris stood. He did not move back. He did not adopt a position of conclusion. He stood at the same distance he had been standing at when the third movement ended, which was close. And he waited with his hands at his sides and his breathing in the same register it had been in when he walked onto the mat. Victor Rasmussen raised himself from the mat. He did it without hurry, in the way of a man who is taking the time the moment deserves rather than the time his ego is asking for. He came to one knee, he came to both feet. He stood at his full 6 feet 11 3/4 inches and looked at the man in front of him who was 10 inches shorter and who had just resolved 19 seconds in a way that nothing in Rasmussen's 12 years of serious practice had given him a model for. Chuck Norris looked at him. Then he reached up. The reach was a long one, and placed his right hand briefly on Rasmussen's left forearm. Not the shoulder, the forearm. The placement of a craftsman indicating a specific location, rather than offering a general comfort. His hand rested there for perhaps 3 seconds. And he said something. He said it at a volume that Frank DeLuca, 8 feet away, could hear the cadence of but not the words. What DeLuca heard was the rhythm of a short statement, perhaps 2 sentences, perhaps 3, with a pause between them that had the character of a period, rather than a comma. Dennis Park was 14 feet away and heard nothing. Raymond Chu was 11 feet away and caught one phrase only, which he would reproduce in a conversation with a journalist 4 years later as something like, that the body already knows the answer and the training is only the process of teaching the mind to stop arguing with it. Whether those were the exact words, no one can confirm. Rasmussen himself has never specified. He has given one interview, conducted in Copenhagen in 1988, in which the morning in Glendale is addressed directly, and in that interview he says only that what was said to him while he was still finding his balance after the third movement was the most precisely aimed thing anyone had ever said to him in a martial context, and that it took him approximately 2 years to fully understand it, and that when he did understand it, it changed the way he taught. He stood on the mat after the hand on the forearm and after the words, and the room waited with him. Frank DeLuca watched his face, for the thing that DeLuca knew would come. The moment when a man of genuine character decides what to do with a lesson he did not ask for and cannot dispute. Rasmussen looked at the mat for a moment. Then he looked up. He said, to the room, that the observation he had made before the demonstration had been correct as a general observation, and incomplete as a specific one, and that the incompleteness was his, and that the morning had corrected it, and that he was grateful. That was all. He did not qualify it. He did not redirect it. He stood in front of 31 people and said the thing that was true without softening the edges of it. Chuck Norris nodded once. He stepped back from the mat. As he passed Dennis Park near the door, Park placed one hand briefly on his upper arm and said nothing. The touch of a man whose vocabulary for the occasion has reached its limit, and who knows that the hand communicates what the words cannot reach. Chuck Norris retrieved his canvas cap from the seat where he had left it, brim down. He set it on his head without adjusting it for several steps. Then, near the stairwell door, he adjusted it, pulling the brim to level, and went through the door and down the stairs, and out of the building. The elevator cable sounded again in the shaft. The overhead lights continued. The mat was the same mat. The story traveled the way stories travel when the people who carry them are practitioners, not through newspapers but through the lines of instruction and relationship that connect dojos across continents. Through letters and phone calls and the specific transmission that happens when a man who was in a room tells the story to a man who trains seriously, who tells it to another man who trains seriously, and each telling passes through a filter of technical understanding that keeps the structural truth intact even as the specific details begin their natural migration. In some accounts it was a different complex, a different month, a different number of witnesses. In some accounts the 3 movements became 2, In others, they became 5. In the version circulating through Scandinavian circuits by 1983, the words spoken over the fallen man had become a formal teaching, attributed to Chuck Norris in the manner of a koan, which is not what they were, but the fact that the story generated that treatment in that community tells you something about the quality of what was understood to have been transmitted. Victor Rasmussen returned to Copenhagen. He spent 3 months not competing and not teaching in his usual format, using that time to dismantle the architecture of his training from its foundations and rebuild it with a different grammar. One that treated close-range fighting not as a failure state to be avoided, but as a domain with its own logic and its own requirements, a domain where the advantage his body conferred became irrelevant, and where the advantage of principle could become decisive. He brought in 2 instructors from outside his lineage. He trained with them for 6 months. He returned to competition in the autumn of 1981 and continued his record with 3 additional wins, the last of which in a tournament in Stockholm was secured by a close-range technique that his opponent did not see coming, and that Rasmussen's students, watching from the side of the floor, had never seen him use before that day. He eventually retired from competition in 1984 and turned full-time to teaching. He ran a studio in Copenhagen for 22 years. The studio produced 4 national-level competitors. In the curriculum he used for the entire duration of those 22 years, the first module, the one he taught to every new student regardless of their experience, was titled simply, Distance. It covered 14 hours over 4 sessions. Students were not permitted to advance to the second module until Rasmussen was satisfied that they had understood everything the first one contained. He never explained publicly where the curriculum had come from, or what had made him design the first module the way he designed it, or why he considered it the foundation of everything that followed. The people in his studio who knew the story of the Thursday morning in Glendale understood. The ones who did not know the story arrived at the understanding anyway, because the module itself, if you paid attention to what it was teaching and how it was structured, made the origin legible. The truth that Thursday morning in March of 1981 demonstrated was not a complicated one, and it does not become more complicated with time. A man who has never been placed at the edge of what he knows, has never been given accurate information about where that edge is. He carries a map drawn from his experience, and the map is detailed, and the map is useful, and the map has served him without failure in every place the map describes. The problem is that the territory always extends past the map, and the extension is not visible on the map, and a man who has not traveled past the map's edge does not know the extension is there. Victor Rasmussen was a genuinely accomplished practitioner whose map was very good and very large and had until that Thursday morning covered every piece of territory he had walked into. What Chuck Norris gave him in 19 seconds was not a defeat, it was a cartographer's correction. Here is where the map ends. The territory continues. A man's understanding of his own limits is only as accurate as the quality of what has tested those limits. And the quality of what tests a man's limits is the only honest teacher any man has ever had. Next week, we are going to tell the story of what happened on the backlot of a studio in Culver City in the summer of 1979, when a former collegiate wrestling champion who had spent 6 years working as a stunt coordinator made a remark about ground fighting to a man who had spent 21 years learning exactly what ground fighting was. That episode is already prepared. Do not miss it. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.